These are the top 10 worst cities to buy a house in America right now. Areas that are just way too expensive and where home prices have a high probability of crashing over the next several years. In fact, the downturn has already started in some of these cities like Las Vegas at number 10, where home prices have dropped by 5.4% over the last year and have another 23% decline to go before Vegas hits its fair value home price of $310,000, with the primary issue in Las Vegas's housing market being an utter lack of affordability. If you were to go to buy a house in Vegas right now, you would have to pay over $400,000 to purchase it, with a typical monthly mortgage and property tax payment of nearly $2,700 a month. Levels that the locals in Las Vegas simply cannot afford, with the median household income in the metro being only $67,000 per year, which means that the typical local in Vegas needs to spend 45% of their gross income to afford house payments in today's housing market. A situation which is not sustainable, especially now that the influx of California home buyers and investors has dropped off. And a big slowdown in investor activity is a problem in our number 9 worst city to buy in America right now. This is an area where the investors flooded in during the pandemic. Lots of people came and bought Airbnbs, and now they are not doing that in Nashville, Tennessee, where data from Redfin shows that the investor purchases have crashed by nearly 60% over the last year, which means that it's the local home buyers in Nashville that now need to support the market, which is a big problem because the typical local in Nashville earns $76,000 per year. That's the median household income, while the payment that they need to come up with for a mortgage and property taxes is now $33,000 a year, which means that they need to spend 44% of their income to buy a house right now, when the long-term historical average is only 23% of income needed to afford a house. And ultimately, what scares me about Nashville's housing market is that it's a city that's actually never gone through a major housing crash. So people in Nashville don't really think it's a possibility. However, when you look at the data, Nashville is one of the most overvalued housing markets in America today, with prices needing to go down by 32.5% before it returns to its long-run historical levels of affordability. That's the 4th most overvalued housing market in America. And one thing to watch out for in Nashville and the state of Tennessee more broadly is the Airbnb market, because there's been a massive slowdown in Airbnb bookings, with a big collapse in Airbnb revenue, which is likely going to lead to some forced selling from these Airbnb investors in Nashville as well as other parts of Tennessee. And I believe forced selling is something we're also going to see in our number 8 worst city to buy in America right now, Portland, Maine, up in the Northeast in New England. Portland is a very sneaky bubble housing market where prices have just exploded over the last several years, with prices increasing from about $300,000 for the typical house before the pandemic to nearly $500,000 today. That's a 40% increase in just 3 years. With that appreciation being driven by lots of people from Boston and New York City moving up to Portland and buying second homes during the pandemic, they pushed the market way up. And when you go on Zillow right now, it's hard to find anything for less than $600,000 near the city center. And so far, Portland has actually been able to hold these prices over the last year during the start of the housing downturn. However, I'm skeptical that that's going to continue into the future because simply the locals can't afford it. With Portland's house payment as a percentage of median income for the average local buyer now registering 49%, the local buyer needs to spend 49% of their gross income to afford a house. That's now as expensive as Boston. What scares me is that there are actually some people who are still buying today at these crazy inflated bubble prices and mortgage payments, and many of these people cannot afford the house that they're buying, and they're becoming house poor, which is a term for people who actually are doing okay financially, but who buy a house and assume a mortgage that they can't afford, which makes them have to cut back on spending in other areas of their life and makes them feel poor. Basically, anyone buying in the housing market today is fitting that description of being house poor, and that creates huge risk of mortgage defaults and foreclosures and all types of issues in the housing market going forward. Because one thing you have to understand as a home buyer and investor is that the U.S. housing market has never been able to sustain these current levels of home prices and mortgage payments, which you can see clearly exemplified on this graph, which tracks inflation-adjusted home prices in America going all the way back to 1890. 130 years of historical data, and what do we see, folks? From 1890 all the way to about the late 1990s, over 100 years, home prices stayed very stable. They grew at the rate of inflation. But then something changed here in the late 90s where we entered that huge housing bubble in the mid 2000s, which came crashing down. Fast forward to today, we're in another bubble that started to come down, but inflation adjusted home prices are still at the highest level of all time. And as you can see, the only other time in US history they came close to being this expensive, they crash. And ultimately, I believe the mechanism that's going to unleash this downturn where prices simply just go back to a level that's more normal and more affordably sustained is going to be the recession and the impending layoffs and issues in the labor market. That's ultimately what's going to be the thing that adds inventory to the housing market for sale, as some of these investors might have issues with liquidity and need to sell. Maybe some Airbnb owners need to sell. Maybe some people get foreclosed on and need to sell. The combination of those factors will push more inventory to the market, especially in our number 7 worst city to buy, Miami. Miami is a city in a metro area that historically gets crushed by recession. With the unemployment rate in Miami hitting 11% at the peak of the last downturn in 2010, it also hit 9.4% in the early 90s downturn, which means that today's unemployment rate in Miami of 2.3%, that's not going to last. That's going to skyrocket in future months and years, which is going to cause lots of distressed selling in Miami's housing market. And when that distressed selling in Miami occurs, my fear for the market is that there's going to be no one there to buy, because the affordability metrics in Miami are some of the worst that you're going to see on this list. With the typical home buyer in Miami needing to cough up $3,000 a month in order to afford mortgage, interest, taxes, and insurance. $3,000 a month for a home buyer in Miami is $36,000 a year, which is nearly 55% of the area's 66,000 median household income. And why is Miami's median income so low? Because like Las Vegas, it's a service-based economy with a lot of low-wage jobs where the wages have not kept pace with inflation or the cost of rent or the cost of home prices, which greatly increases the odds of a big downturn. And if you need further evidence about what's going to come in Miami, just look at history. Yes, the home prices have boomed over the last couple of years, but notice a similar boom that occurred in the early 2000s that then led to a big massive crash where prices went down 50%. I don't think prices are going to go down 50% in Miami again. However, could they go down 20, 25, or 30%? Yeah, I think so. Miami's housing market is 32% overvalued compared to its long-term historical fundamentals. And of course, one of the reasons Miami's housing market became overvalued was because of all the people who moved in during the pandemic, especially from our number 6 worst city to buy, New York. Lots of people fled the high cost of living in New York. However, that cost of living really hasn't come down too much. With the typical cost of a home in Manhattan now registering $1.2 million. But really what makes New York expensive is the fact that even when you go outside New York City to the outlying areas in Long Island or Northern Jersey or Westchester, the prices are still crazy high. For instance, if you just travel 15 miles north of New York City to Bronxville, you would have to pay $1.6 million to buy a 4-bed, 3-bath house that's 3,000 square feet. The monthly cost of buying this house at today's mortgage rates would be $11,000 per month. And the reason that these prices in and around New York City are still so expensive is because, number one, the income levels there are high. There's lots of wealth in and around New York. But number two, more importantly, they don't build any new homes, which is one of the reasons I don't actually think we're going to see a major housing crash in the New York City area, with the metro clocking in at about 12% overvalued right now. Before getting further into this video and looking at the top 5 worst cities to buy, everyone, I want to draw a distinction between expensive and overvalued, because those two things are not the same. Certain areas of America, like New York and parts of California, are expensive and have been expensive for a long time for a variety of factors related to wealth and restrictions in home building. Meanwhile, other areas around America, like the boom towns during the pandemic, such as Nashville, they're not that expensive nominally, but they are very overvalued because home prices and mortgage payments in those housing markets have surged up to levels that have never been experienced before. And it's really that surge in prices and mortgage payments above income growth that tips you off to the fact that your housing market is in a bubble and is not such a great place to buy right now. A situation that's very apparent in our number 5 worst city to buy a house, Phoenix, Arizona. This is another city where the housing downturn has already started, with prices down 5.4% over the last year. However, like Las Vegas, it's still very overvalued, with 25% more downside to go if prices in Phoenix go down to their historical norms in relation to local income. And Phoenix is a housing market with all types of problems right now. It's not just home prices that are going down. Rents are also going down in Phoenix, as are Airbnb revenues, a signal that aggregate housing demand in the metro is on the decline and that the recent drop in inventory in Phoenix is going to be short-lived. Moving on to our number 4 worst city to buy a house. This is actually the most expensive housing market on this list. The typical home price in this area is over $1 million across the metro, which has 5 million people in it, which is absolutely wild. Where am I talking about? That would be San Francisco, California, where you still have to spend $1.1 million to buy the typical house, a price which has actually dropped by nearly 10% over the last year. However, as you can see, it's still way higher than it was historically, indicating that there's still more downside for prices in the Bay Area. San Francisco is also plagued by a variety of quality of life issues. There's rampant crime in the urban area, there's fewer and fewer people visiting the city, and the area's main economic driver, tech, is in a big recession right now, with companies like Google, Meta, Salesforce, Cisco, Twitter, PayPal, Yahoo, and Zoom all doing big layoffs. And these home price declines in San Francisco, they're likely to spread to other areas in Northern California, because these cities tend to be very related. In fact, one area that a lot of people left from San Francisco to go to during the pandemic was Sacramento, our number 3 worst city to buy in America right now. In Sacramento, the typical price of a home is all the way up to $565,000, price which is down by 7% over the last year, but is still likely too high because the locals in Sacramento, they can't afford it. To buy a standard 3-bed, 2-bath house in the metro, you need to spend anywhere from $550,000 to $600,000, which comes at a cost of over $4,000 a month in terms of your payment. Now that's an issue because the median household in Sacramento earns $85,000. So if the average cost to buy is $4,000 a month, that's $48,000 a year, which is more than 50% of the gross income in the area. So ultimately, both the prices and the mortgage rates in Sacramento need to go down for most home buyers to be able to even qualify for a mortgage. And it's important to understand that not every city in America is like the cities on this list. There's lots of places in America where the prices and the mortgage payments are still relatively affordable for local home buyers and where there isn't really much of a housing bubble, with data from Reventure app showing that areas in the middle of America, in the Midwest and Deep South, offer much more affordability. For instance, in Arkansas, the local home buyer only needs to spend 26% of their gross income on a house payment to buy a house right now. Meanwhile, in Iowa, it's 26%, and in Ohio, it's 29%, which compares to 64% in a state like California, or 51% in Idaho, or 47% in Florida. But the housing market in our number 2 worst city to buy is not fundamentally supported. This is an area where prices boomed during the pandemic. Lots of people moved in, lots of investors came in, they bid the prices way up, way more than the incomes grew, which is now creating problems for Orlando, Florida. Orlando is a housing market which is now 27% overvalued. The typical home price today of $386,000 could go down to $281,000 if prices in this area return to the long-term historical norms compared to income. And those incomes, they're fairly low. The median household income in Orlando is $68,000, which means that the average buyer needs to spend 44% of their gross income to be able to afford the monthly payment. And what concerns me about Orlando more than some other cities in Florida is the fact that its economy is very exposed to downturns and recessions, because the employment base there all comes basically from tourism. People go to Disney, they vacation with their family, and the result is lots of low-wage service jobs in Orlando supporting that local housing market. With today's 2.6% unemployment rate in Orlando very unlikely to last. I mean, take a look at what happened in 2006. The unemployment rate in Orlando went to 2.3% during that last expansion and then skyrocketed to 11% during the last crash. So this is an area with lots of potential for job losses and mortgage defaults and home price declines into the future, so be very careful if you're buying in Orlando. But be even more careful if you're a home buyer looking in our number 1 worst city to buy a house in America today. This is a city that checks every single box in terms of being overvalued, expensive, having a huge risk of job losses in a recession. This is a place that I would not want to be buying right now because lots of people bought in this city back in 2006 and 2007 and then lost 50% on their home home value over the next 5 years. A lot of people got wiped out in Riverside and San Bernardino, California, which is our #1 worst metro area to buy in right now. I don't think the prices in Riverside are going to crash by 50% again. However, could they go down by 20% or 25% or 30%? Absolutely, especially when you look at the history of Riverside's economy. Now, one last thing before signing off, everyone. Is there any way that I'm wrong about these housing markets and that they're actually good places to buy? Well, the only way that I could see myself being wrong is if America in these cities has crazy inflation going forward. Like for 5 to 10 years, if the inflation rate is over 6 or 7%, with wages going up enough to bring down those home value to income ratios and to bring down those house payment to income ratios. But absent that level of inflation and wage growth, I don't see any way that these cities can sustain themselves. So be very careful if you're a home buyer in these areas. If you are buying today, you're buying into a massive bubble. And if you're someone who wants to learn more about the US housing market and the data in this video for your city, I would encourage you, go to the Reventure app, www.reventure.app. This is a program I developed that has home price and demographic data on every city, state, and county in America, and it's free to use. So check it out if you're a home buyer, real estate investor, or data nerd. There's a link in the description.